Renaissance Woodworker. I'm Shannon Rogers, your host, and I want to continue on this chisel technique theme. In my last video, I talked about making tapered sliding dovetails, but the MacGuffin, if you will, the hidden point of the whole video was to embrace the chisel and hone your chisel handling skills in order to increase just your comfort with a lot of more unusual tasks. So today I actually want to talk about making a blind dado, or really a blind joint of any kind. It can't really be sawn. You can bore it a little bit. It definitely can't be done with a plane. And in the end, it just comes down to the chisel. And with some comfortability and refinement of your chisel techniques, you'll find that these common joints really don't have to hold you up at all. And there's just a few key techniques that if you learn them now on a relatively simple blind dado, you'll be able to apply them across a great deal of other joints. Now I'm finishing up an ingrain rabbet, otherwise known as a philister right now, and that's really exactly the same as the sliding dovetail tail that I cut last time, except now I've just got a straight wall. Now because this philister is a through joint, this is a perfect opportunity to use something like a plane to refine this. And these old wooden rabbet planes, they're actually one of my most favorite tools in the shop because they're just so versatile. You know, no fences, no depth stops. I can drop it right in and plane this to get a nice coplanar surface. Obviously, I want to have some kind of stop behind it because force is going that way and I'm not supported. But the plane can also get you in a little bit of trouble here. This is a relatively wide surface. It's about 5 inches wide, but you can see the plane is quite a bit longer than that, and you can get a fair amount of rocking, and it's real easy to kind of get a hump in the middle here as the plane rocks off the end or rocks up on the start, or you can very easily taper this so that it's thinner or a deeper cut on the far end than the other end. As you move into even narrower pieces, working with stiles, rails, or something like that, that may be 2 or 2.5 inches wide, this is exasperated even more, and really using the chisel is the best way to do this. And like I said, it's exactly the same as the technique we used last time. I will use this pivoting technique, and having set the floor of my rabbet according to my layout lines down here, I can continue to use the chisel referencing off that surface and walk my way right across this. And as you saw in the opening of this video, really the chisel is used greatly in the initial roughing in steps of this particular rabbet, chopping or splitting away the bulk of the waste. Even if I was going to use the plane, I would still use the chisel to rough this into place. Certainly the plane could do it from start to finish, but it's going to be a lot slower than, you know, whacking away 90–95% of the waste and then coming back and just refining it slightly with the plane. In this case, with a joint that's really only this big, it makes no sense to reach for my plane when I already have the chisel in my hand, and I can very easily refine the joint and, if necessary, check it for square and remove any parts that are out of line. But I can see this is right in line with all my lines. The square tells me that it's nice and flat and square. This philister or ingrain rabbet is ready to go, just using a chisel, well, and a saw to saw across the grain. This is about the blind dado and not the rabbet, because as I said, it's basically what we did last time. But I did want to revisit this again because that same pivoting technique that I use is really one of the core chisel handling techniques that you need to have in your arsenal. In the case of the blind dado, here again we're working across the grain. We're working in an enclosed space that the plane can't work all the way through. You can still saw out the walls if you want, and that's a great way to kind of speed up the process here. But even then, you need a relief valve, a release area where the saw can work its way into. So with a blind dado, and here I've got one laid out that actually should fit this piece. I laid it out around that piece, but it stops right here. So what I want to do is create that little relief in there to give me a spot for the saw to work into, but also to give me a spot for the chisel to work into as I work across the grain. So the first thing I'll do is come down to the end and essentially chop out a little mortise. I work right in the middle working along the grain, again, like I'm chopping out a mortise. Just break up the waste a little. I'll grab a narrower chisel, and here's the first technique, if you will, working that chisel bevel down. The first thing you always want to do is always maintain contact with the workpiece. So when I've got the chisel bevel down, my palm is always on the workpiece, anchored to the workpiece. I liken this to writing with a pen or a pencil. If you just sign your name, you're always going to have your palm on the piece of paper. If you try to do it with just the pencil touching, you'll lose that control, and your handwriting looks as bad as my handwriting does normally. You just really don't have that contact. We anchor our hands in order to have better penmanship, to have more accuracy with that pencil tip. This is your pencil tip, exact same thing. So I've got my hand anchored on the work, and I'm doing all of the pushing with my offhand, raising and lowering the chisel to kind of ride that bevel. Because there's no sole or fence here to work with, you can actually manipulate the chisel around curves and really get into areas that are nearly impossible to get with something like a plane. Now, I don't want to get too carried away because I do want to make sure I'm severing the fibers along the edge of this dado. So that's the other thing. Now that I've removed some material and I've got a release valve, a place for the waste to wedge into, I can put my chisel right in my knife line. And once I've severed those long grain fibers, you'll find that everything comes away a lot easier, and you can really dig in there with the chisel and continue to hollow out the surface. With all those fibers severed, and that frees up a little bit of space that I can now run my saw into. So I've done a little knife wall first class cut along the edges here, and I can drop my saw in that and work my way back to that gap that I chiseled. And the key is I'm actually raising the handle and I'm sawing really with just the toe, plowing my way back, while I have to take a really short saw stroke because it's bumping into the edge of that. I can use the toe of the saw to kind of work in very specific areas. Work just in this one area, make sure that it's level the rest of it, or work right at the terminus of the cut until I work down to my line and repeat it on the other side. My fingers are acting kind of like training wheels. They will work their way along the length of the cut and act like a fence. And then, just like I did with the dovetail, I dropped this center Morton cut right down the middle to help break up the waste and make the job for the chisel a little bit easier. But this is really a video about chiseling and not sawing, so let's get to the chiseling. Now, this is a 3/4 inch chisel. This is a 3/4 inch dado. So you might want to go straight to the 3/4 inch. Frankly, I don't like to push quite so much steel. There's also the risk, especially on these initial cuts, of using that and having these corners catch and peel up a little bit. In fact, you can see I got a little bit of tearing down here as I was chopping, as I was scooping out with a wider chisel, and I just caught the edge and peeled it up. So you want to be cautious of that. Step down a chisel size or two, and you'll find that just by driving a narrower amount of steel, it's just a lot less work. I will start right on the edge, and I'm actually going to go bevel up, and I can position the chisel about halfway into the waist. So I'm really just splitting the whole thing in half. And I've got my hands around the blade, and my fingers are anchored to my bench hook, not to the workpiece this time, but to the bench hook. And what this allows me to do is kind of ride my fingers forward and act like a depth stop. Instead of having the chisel out here free, able to move up and down and increase its depth of cut or reduce its depth of cut, as long as I keep my fingers riding along here, I can pretty much maintain a level cut. Now, as you go deeper and deeper into this, the bevel is going to work against you, meaning that the chisel is always going to want to move the opposite direction of the bevel. The bevel it's a wedge, and it's driving that cutting edge down. So while the bevel is up, the more you chop, the more waste is pushing back on the bevel, the more it's going to drive deeper into the cut. So you want to be really cautious here. But what I'm trying to do is remove the waste either right to my line or pretty dang close to my line. A lot of that depends upon how the wood is cutting. This poplar's pretty agreeable. So I can get a hair's breadth away from my line and have a pretty straight cut. Now I can continue, because I've got, the length of the chisel, I can continue to work my way in. But you're gonna run into trouble real fast, and it's gonna wanna start to dive in. And it just dove down a little bit there. In fact, I may end up with a tiny little hollow when this is sunk to its final depth. It's not a huge deal in this particular instance. But now is when I actually wanna flip it over and go bevel down. Now in a previous video, you saw me use a crank neck chisel like this. And you may think this is a great opportunity to use a crank neck chisel to have the ability to work further across. These should be treated kind of like a router plane in the fact that they're not really meant to remove a huge amount of material, because the same wedging action is at play. While this is bevel up, as I continue to drive in, it's going to want to drive this deeper and deeper. And you can certainly ride the flat of this chisel along the bottom here in order to maintain that depth of cut. But until this is a flat surface and still it can be treated like a reference surface, I don't really want to ride the chisel along it. That's why it's really more of a refining tool. Once I'm very, very close and I just want to come in and kind of plane the surface, that's where this chisel comes into play. It certainly can be used for rougher stuff, but I just find, again, I happen to have a regular bench chisel in hand. I might as well flip it over, go bevel down, anchor my hand to the workpiece, and you can use hand pressure if you want, but here's an instance where, kind of like carving or working with a V-gouge, you actually have a little bit more control with a mallet, just taking light taps. And I can watch to see how the chisel is cutting. Is the chisel riding up out of the cut or driving down into the cut? If I'm riding up out of the cut, I raise the handle and it starts to cut deeper. If I'm cutting too deep, I lower the handle and it'll start to rise up. Ideally, very much like wood turning, you want to actually ride the bevel. The bevel is now the new flat of the chisel. But the cool part is because that bevel is so much narrower than this big long flat, I've got the ability to turn, raising and lowering and guiding and steering that chisel as I work my way through here. The key is always this hand firmly on the work. And on this initial cut, I don't want to get carried away. I will tend to actually drop the handle, you can see, and kind of scoop my way out of the cut. What I prefer to do is get this initial bit of waste removed and below this delicate edge. I don't want to mar that edge. So as I'm chopping, on the surface, I'm relatively close to it, there's always a chance that I'll grab that edge and splinter it or tear it up or something like that. So I'm purposely trying to take a lighter cut and letting the chisel, the handle, drop and ride up out of the cut, just so that I can get it sunk a little bit and away from that top edge. So now I'm 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more below that top edge. And really this is only about 1/4 inch deep total. You can see I'm at very close to my final depth down here, and I can just even run a finger along and just look at it and see that I'm high in the middle. So now what I want to do is really start to use this steering, this steerability of it, raising and lowering and working on riding that bevel. And essentially planing the surface. That's what these little taps of the hammer are great for. Taking tiny, tiny up and down adjustments and just looking at my shaving that's coming out of here and essentially creating an even depth to the floor of this dado. And if you start to feel like you're having trouble controlling the whole thing, choke up on the chisel a little bit more. In other words, grab the pencil closer to the tip. And you can really let the chisel glide along the surface. And as it hits a high spot, you'll feel it engage a little bit more. As it hits a low spot, it'll start to move along the floor of this a little bit easier. So it's about now that you're thinking, well, you idiot, why don't you just grab a router plane? In this particular instance, absolutely. This will be the plane that would come back and refine this. Notice I say refine this. I see a lot of people using this tool to create joinery. This does not make joinery, it refines joinery. This thing, this blade dangles down below this sole. It's completely unsupported. It will create tear out. It will cause all kinds of problems if you try to take a heavier cut. Now that I am a hair's breadth from my line and I have a pretty flat surface, I can come back with this and in 2 or 3 passes, clean it up, get it to final depth, really fine tune that final depth and get it nice and flat. And that's perfect in this particular application. But imagine you were working on an inside corner where you couldn't work right up against it with the plane, or you're working on very tight quarters, or you're working on the edge of a board and using a plane like this can be particularly tippy. There are lots of instances where this router plane really wouldn't be the best solution for the tool, and you just use the chisel to continue to refine it. There are some times when you're just cutting a really, really small blind dado, what we might even call a gain rather than a dado, and it actually doesn't make sense to stop what you're doing, turn around and grab the router plane. I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot, especially in my shop, to turn around, reach that far, grab my router plane. There's a reason my router plane's in the door, because it's a tool that gets used a lot. But if I'm down here working, to actually stop what I'm doing, come over and grab it, I could actually have it done in the amount of time it might take to just come in and refine the floor of this a little bit more. And that again is where this technique of keeping the hand anchored, and now I can start to make little scooping cuts and fine tune exactly where the high spots are. I can also, with my hand anchored on the work, I can put a fair amount of pressure down on the bevel and really let the bevel ride along the surface and pick up any high spots. The same thing could be done with this crank neck chisel. Now that I'm at pretty close to the depth and I've got a relatively flat surface, I can run this chisel along and it will find those little high spots. Because I can actually press down on the back of the chisel, use this long back as a reference surface, a plane sole, if you will. And you know, we have chisel planes. Well, here is the archetypical chisel plane. It's called a chisel, being used like you've got a flat sole on the bottom. And that's really where these crank neck gouges excel. This is what they're designed to do. Right along there, grab those high spots and go from there. And you'll actually find that this crank neck gouge does a better job of flattening out the dado surface than the router plane does. The real advantage the router plane has is you can set a depth stop and make sure that you're all at the exact same depth. But I'm already at depth back here. I know that because I can see my layout line. So I just need to work this chisel right along from there and work it all the way back. Or again, using the exact same technique, riding the bevel down and chop my way along, steering the chisel, taking a deeper cut or a lighter cut, working all the way back until I remove that little high spot, and I've got a dado that is now nice and flat and hopefully fits my mating piece. And there we go, one blind dado, nice and snug. Now, as before, my goal is not to have you, eschewing other planes and we've got to just go back to basics and use nothing but chisels. That's ridiculous. There are going to be lots of specialty tools out there that are going to do a job really well. Like I said, in this particular instance, I would have grabbed my router plane a while ago just to finish this up. But having the ability to work in those tight spots or work on a curve where that router plane wouldn't be of use here, being able to grab the chisel and having the skills to apply the chisel in weird situations is going to make you a better woodworker in the long run. The other thing that I've discovered over the years of working entirely by hand is those little time savings that come from not stopping what I'm doing and grabbing another tool, but just finishing the job with the tool that's in my hand. Like I said, if this were a much shorter, narrow, or smaller dado, I would have just done the entire thing with a chisel. I wouldn't even have grabbed the saw. It would have been so much faster instead of stopping and changing tools just to complete the job with the chisel, assuming that you have the comfort working with the chisel. So just another basic joint, but one that we run into a lot in casework where you need that blind cut. Now that you know how to do it with a chisel, you'll be that much more capable when this joint comes up again.